My mother-in-law has never once called my son by his name. In 3 years of Sunday dinners, holiday gatherings, and birthday parties, she has referred to him as your boy or him, or when she's feeling particularly generous, the child. Never Owen. Never sweetheart. Never anything that would imply he belonged at her table the same way her other grandchildren did. I told myself it was a generational thing. I told myself she was warming up slowly, that some people just needed time to adjust to unconventional family arrangements. I told myself a lot of things in those 3 years, mostly because the alternative, accepting that a grown woman had decided my 8-year-old son didn't deserve basic human acknowledgement, was too exhausting to sit with every single day. My name is Claire, and I'm 31 years old. I met my husband Nathan when Owen was 4. Nathan knew from our second date that Owen was a package deal, and he didn't flinch. Not once. He showed up to our third date with a set of those magnetic building tiles Owen had been obsessed with, the ones I'd mentioned offhandedly, and I remember thinking, this is either someone who pays very close attention, or someone who is trying very hard. It turned out to be both. We got married 2 years later in a small ceremony at a botanical garden outside of Atlanta. Owen was the ring bearer. He wore a tiny navy suit and walked down the aisle with the absolute solemnity of someone performing open-heart surgery, which made every person in attendance laugh and tear up at the same time. Nathan's eyes were already wet before Owen even reached the end of the aisle. I fell in love with him twice that afternoon. Nathan's mother, Loretta, attended the wedding. She sat in the front row and smiled for photos and hugged me at the reception, and said all the right things about how lovely everything was. She did not once mention Owen in her toast. I noticed, and then I told myself I was being too sensitive, looking for things to be upset about on my own wedding day. Old habit. I was good at talking myself out of noticing things that were right in front of me. The pattern started small, the way these things always do. Loretta would bring gifts for her daughter's children, Nathan's niece and nephew, Becca and Miles, and nothing for Owen. Or she'd bring Owen something, but it would be an afterthought, a gas station candy bar while the other kids got wrapped presents with bows. I'd mention it to Nathan quietly, and he'd look uncomfortable and say his mother was old-fashioned, that she didn't mean anything by it. He believed that. I could tell he genuinely believed it, and I didn't want to be the person who forced him to see his mother differently, so I let it go. Again and again and again, I let it go. But Owen noticed. Kids always notice. He just didn't say anything about it for a long time, because 8-year-olds who have spent their whole lives watching adults navigate complicated feelings learn very quickly to keep their observations to themselves. He'd just go a little quiet at family gatherings, a little smaller, and I would watch it happen and feel something twisting in my chest that I couldn't name and wouldn't let myself act on. Nathan's sister Priya had organized a big family Christmas at Loretta's house that year. Nathan's parents had a sprawling ranch-style house in Alpharetta with enough room for everyone, and Priya had been planning it since October. A catered dinner, a photo booth in the living room, matching pajamas for all the grandchildren. I want you to hold on to that word. All. I had called Priya 3 weeks before to confirm Owen's pajama size, because she'd texted asking for the kids' measurements. She wrote back immediately with a thumbs-up emoji. I didn't think about it again. The day of the Christmas dinner, we arrived around 4 in the afternoon. Owen was vibrating with excitement. He'd been making Nathan a gift for 2 weeks, a hand-painted ceramic mug he'd done at one of those pottery studios, with a lopsided Christmas tree and Nathan's name spelled in wobbly red letters. He'd asked to carry it himself in its little box, and he held it on his lap the entire drive from our house to Alpharetta, checking the lid every 10 minutes to make sure it hadn't shifted. The house looked beautiful. Garland on the staircase, a tree in the corner that had to be 9 feet tall, candles in every window. Loretta had outdone herself, and I gave her credit for it. I really did try to see the good things. Priya was by the door with the pajamas, handing them out as people arrived. She gave a set to Becca and Miles immediately, matching red and green plaid, very cute. And then she saw us, and her face did something I will never forget as long as I live. It flickered. Just for a second. A flash of something she recovered from so fast I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. She gave me a set of pajamas. She gave Nathan a set. She did not have a set for Owen. I asked her about it quietly, stepping slightly to the side so Owen couldn't hear. She lowered her voice too and told me the pajamas were for the grandchildren, and that Loretta had made the order. She said it like she was apologizing for a weather forecast. Like it was beyond anyone's control. I stood there for a moment and thought very carefully about what I was going to do. I told Priya that Owen was a grandchild, actually, and that I'd texted her his size 3 weeks ago. She got a look on her face that was equal parts guilty and resigned, and she said she knew, but that her mother had specifically said the pajamas were for blood grandchildren only, and she hadn't wanted to make it into a thing. I said very calmly that I understood, and I took my pajamas and Nathan's pajamas and I went to find my son. Owen was in the living room already talking to Becca and Miles about something, laughing about some video they'd all apparently seen at school. He looked relaxed. He looked happy. I felt a specific kind of grief watching him not yet know what I knew. I pulled Nathan aside into the hallway and told him what had happened. I watched his expression move through about 5 different things in 10 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, something that looked like the beginning of anger. And then the thing I had seen too many times, the retreat into explanation. He said maybe there was a mix-up, maybe Priya got the order wrong, maybe his mother hadn't realized. I told him there was no mix-up. I told him what Priya had said, word for word. He went quiet, and then he said, "Let me talk to her." He went to find his mother. I went back to the living room and sat near Owen, pretending to look at my phone while my heart was doing something loud and irregular inside my chest. About 15 minutes later, a woman I'd never particularly liked decided to make everything so much worse. I heard Loretta before I saw her. She had that voice that carried, the kind that was always just slightly too loud for the space it was in. She came into the living room where all 3 kids were sitting together on the floor in front of the tree, and she called Becca and Miles over to her. She made a whole production of it, telling them to come get a special photo with Grandma in their Christmas pajamas, ushering them to the photo booth Priya had set up in the corner. Owen looked up. He watched Becca and Miles get up and go stand with their grandmother. And then he looked down at himself, still in his regular clothes, and I watched the understanding move across his face the way a cloud moves across the sky. He didn't cry, he just went very still. I don't fully remember making the decision to stand up. I remember being seated, and then I remember being across the room, and Loretta was giving me this look like she was surprised to find me standing next to her, and I said, in a voice I barely recognized, that Owen would be in the photo too. Loretta looked at me the way she always looked at me when I said something she found inconvenient. Patient, condescending. She said the photo was for family. I said Owen was family. She said, and I want you to understand that she said this in front of her daughter, her grandchildren, and 2 of her neighbors who had dropped by for the party. She said that she loved Nathan very much, but that she had to be honest, that Owen wasn't really her grandchild in the way that mattered. And that she didn't want to start pretending now because she thought it was kinder in the long run to be clear about these things. Kinder. She used the word kinder. I felt the room shift. Priya had gone pale. The neighbors were looking at their shoes. Becca, who was 11 and sharper than most adults I knew, had grabbed Miles by the hand. And Owen was standing next to me, very still holding the little box with the mug in it. And he was looking at Loretta with this expression I cannot describe except to say it was the expression of a child, realizing for the first time that an adult he'd been trying to win over had already made up their mind. That's when Nathan walked in. He had been looking for his mother, I found out later. He'd checked the kitchen, the back porch, the dining room, and now he was standing in the doorway of the living room in his Christmas sweater. And he was taking in the scene. He looked at his mother. He looked at Priya's face. He looked at the neighbors, staring at the floor. He looked at me, and then he looked at Owen. I watched Nathan's face do the thing I had never seen it do before. It didn't retreat into explanation. It didn't search for a more comfortable interpretation. Something in him simply landed, the way a plane finally touches down after a very long flight, and he walked into the room. He didn't say anything to his mother. Not yet. He walked past her directly to Owen, and he crouched down so he was at Owen's eye level, and he put both hands on Owen's shoulders, and he said quietly but with total certainty, "Hey, you're my son, okay? In every way that matters. Don't ever forget that." Owen looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded, once, very small. Nathan stood up and turned to face the room. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't performing. He was just a man who had finally stopped finding ways to see around something that had been directly in front of him for 3 years. He looked at his mother and said that he needed her to understand something, because he should have said it a long time ago and he was sorry he hadn't. He said that Owen was his son. Not his stepson, not Claire's boy, not the child. His son. He said that he had chosen that, actively and deliberately, every single day for 3 years, and that anyone who couldn't honor that choice was choosing not to be part of his family. Loretta started to say something. Nathan raised one hand, not aggressively, just firmly, and kept going. He said he understood that she hadn't expected their family to look like this. He said he understood that she had ideas about blood and about what family meant, and that he'd spent 3 years hoping she'd work through those ideas on her own. But he wasn't going to keep hoping anymore, because every day he kept hoping, Owen was sitting in rooms where he didn't feel like he belonged, and that was not something Nathan was willing to keep doing. He told her that if she wanted to be in their lives, in his life, in Owen's life, in my life, she needed to decide right now whether she was going to treat Owen like a grandchild, not eventually, not after she'd had time to adjust now. The room was completely silent. The Christmas music was still playing from a speaker somewhere in the kitchen. I think it was a Mariah Carey song, which, in retrospect, was almost funny. Loretta looked at Nathan for a long time. Then she looked at me. Then she looked at Owen, who had not moved, who was still holding that box. She said, "I don't know why you're making such a scene at Christmas." Nathan said, "Mom, that's not an answer." She pressed her lips together. Priya spoke up from across the room. She said quietly, "He's right, Mom. He's been right for 3 years and we've all just been pretending not to see it." She looked at Owen and said, "I'm sorry, buddy. I should have pushed back on the pajama thing. That wasn't okay." She said it to him directly, not to Nathan or to me, to Owen. Something about that, being addressed directly, being seen by an adult who wasn't his parent, made Owen's chin wobble. Just for a second. He pressed it back down, the way kids do when they're determined not to cry, and then he just said, "It's okay," which was both the most forgiving thing I'd ever heard and the saddest. Priya shook her head and said, "It's not, actually, but we're going to do better." Loretta, for her part, didn't apologize. I hadn't expected her to. Not right away. Some things take longer to move through a person than one uncomfortable evening, and I'd stopped expecting dramatic transformations from people who'd spent decades being certain they were right. But she also didn't double down. She sat down in the armchair by the tree and she went quiet, and eventually, in a stilted, awkward way that was clearly effortful for her, she asked Owen what grade he was in. Owen told her 3rd grade. She asked what his favorite subject was. He thought about it and said science, because they'd been doing experiments with vinegar and baking soda. She said that sounded messy. He said it was really messy, actually, and that his teacher had worn goggles even though it wasn't necessary, just to be dramatic. Loretta didn't smile, exactly. But something in her face shifted very slightly, the way ice shifts in spring, when the thaw has begun but you can't yet say it's gone. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't resolution. It was a crack in something that had been sealed shut for 3 years, and I didn't know yet what was going to grow in that crack. But I knew it hadn't been there before dinner. Later, after the catered food had been eaten and the photo booth had been reopened, and Priya had taken every combination of photos she could think of, including several with Owen front and center, Nathan found me in the kitchen refilling my water glass. He put his hand on the back of my neck in the way he always did, that steady, solid warmth, and he said, "I'm sorry it took me this long." I told him I knew. I told him I understood that seeing your parents clearly was one of the hardest things a person could do. I told him that what mattered was that he'd seen it, and that he'd said something, and that he'd said it in front of everyone who needed to hear it. He said, "She's going to call me tomorrow and tell me I embarrassed her." I said, "Probably." He said, "I don't care." And that was the thing. The thing I hadn't been sure of for 3 years, the question I hadn't let myself ask out loud because I was afraid of the answer. When it came down to it, when the moment arrived, who would he choose? Not because I wanted him to cut off his mother, not because I needed a dramatic gesture, but because I needed to know that Owen, my son, the person I loved most on earth, was safe in this family, that someone other than me would fight for him when fighting was required. I had my answer. We drove home late, Owen asleep in the back seat by the time we reached the highway. He was still wearing his regular clothes. Priya had offered to order him a matching pajama set and ship it to the house, and he'd said thank you very seriously, like he was accepting a business proposal. The ceramic mug was back in its box beside him, because Nathan had opened it at dinner and made such a genuine, unself-conscious fuss about it that Owen had glowed for the rest of the evening. Nathan had immediately declared it his work mug and said everyone at his office was going to be jealous, which Owen found enormously satisfying. I watched the highway lights move across the window, and I thought about all the times in the past 3 years I had talked myself out of what I was seeing. All the times I had chosen the more comfortable explanation, because the real one was too heavy to carry. I hadn't been wrong to do that, exactly. I had been protecting my marriage, protecting Nathan's relationship with his family, protecting the peace in a situation that didn't offer many good options. But I had also, in doing that, asked Owen to absorb something that was never his to absorb. I wasn't going to do that anymore. I had decided somewhere between the photo booth and the kitchen, somewhere in the space between Priya saying we're going to do better and Loretta asking about the baking soda experiments. I had decided that patience had its place, but that it had run its course and that whatever came next. However Loretta responded, however the family dynamics shifted, however many uncomfortable holidays followed this one, we would handle it together. All three of us. Nathan reached over in the dark and found my hand without looking, the same way he always did. We didn't talk about what had happened. It felt like something that had already finished resolving, that had found its own shape and settled into it, and talking about it would have been like talking about gravity. It was just true now. It had been said. Loretta called the next morning as predicted. I don't know what she said because Nathan took the call in the backyard and I didn't ask. He came back in 20 minutes later, poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table across from me. She's upset, he said. I know, I said. She thinks I embarrassed her in front of the neighbors. I know. He looked at his coffee for a moment. Then he said, I told her that I loved her and that the door was always open, but that the only thing that would change anything was her behavior toward Owen. Not her feelings. I know feelings take time. Her behavior. I nodded. He said she hung up. I nodded again. He said I'm okay with it. I believed him. Not because he didn't love his mother. He clearly did, in the complicated, layered way that adult children love difficult parents, carrying both the person they hoped she was and the person she actually was at the same time. But because he had finally stopped letting that love cost Owen something. Christmas afternoon, when Owen woke up from a long sleep and wandered into the kitchen in his socks, Nathan was already at the table. Owen sat down across from him without saying anything, opened up his box of cereal, and started eating. After a while, he said, without looking up, Is Grandma Loretta going to be weird now? Nathan said, Maybe for a little while. But I talked to her this morning. Owen said, What did you say? Nathan said, I told her that I loved her, but that you were my son and that she needed to act like it. Owen turned his spoon over in his cereal for a moment. Then he said, Did she say okay? Nathan said, Not exactly. Not yet. But I'm hoping she will. Owen thought about that. Then he said, I made her a card once, for her birthday. She said thank you, but I didn't see her put it anywhere. Nathan looked at him. He said, I didn't know that. Owen shrugged. I didn't really think you did. The quiet in the kitchen after that was one of the heaviest things I have ever sat inside. Nathan reached across the table and put his hand on top of Owen's, and Owen let him, which was its own kind of answer, because 8-year-olds do not let you hold their hands unless they actually want you to. I turned back to the counter so that they wouldn't see my face. I don't know how the story with Loretta ends. I don't have the kind of resolution where everything wraps up and everyone grows, and the grandmother realizes she was wrong and sends flowers. Maybe she will, eventually. Maybe she won't. Maybe Owen will spend the next several years of his life calibrating how much of himself to bring into her living room, and maybe that will always feel a little sad, and maybe that's just the true shape of some families. Complicated, imperfect. Held together by the people who choose to do the hard work, even when the people around them don't. But I know this. The next time there's a family gathering, and there's a photo being taken, and someone calls for the grandchildren, Nathan will be the first one to make sure Owen is in it. Not because he needs to prove something. Not because he's watching for slights, but because Owen is his son, and that's what fathers do. He told me that on the drive home, when Owen was already asleep, and the highway was dark, and we were just two people in a car trying to figure out what kind of family they were building. He said, I should have done that a long time ago. I'm sorry. I told him the same thing I always tell him when he apologizes for things he genuinely means. That I knew, that I saw him trying, and that what mattered now was what happened next. What happens next is that Owen is going to keep making cards for people because that's who he is. He's going to keep being generous with his affection, even when he doesn't always get it back, because some people are just built that way, open-handed and hopeful in a way that the world keeps trying to train out of them. And the next time he sakes one, someone is going to put it somewhere. That's the promise Nathan made. Not out loud, not in so many words, but I heard it in the kitchen that Christmas morning, in the silence after Owen said he didn't think Nathan knew about the card. I heard it, and I held on to it, and I am still holding on to it.